In the spirit of reconciliation, the Greek community of Melbourne acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Good evening, Kalisperasas. I hope you've all had an enjoyable Easter. Welcome to our 8th seminar of 2023 in the Greek Community of Melbourne's Public History and Culture Seminar Series. As I mentioned in the initial seminar this year, the seminars in 2023 will be almost equally split between face-to-face delivery at the mezzanine level of the Greek Centre, when we have local or interstate speakers, and online delivery when we have international guests. There will be no hybrid seminars, but we will be posting the presentations online after the event when we have permission from the presenters. Our next 4 seminars will be held at the mezzanine level of the Greek Centre as we regain the use of the venue after the Comedy Festival. Next week's seminar at the mezzanine level will be on the 27th of April, where Dr. Effie Steriopoulos will give the Anzac Day Memorial Lecture. With respect to today's seminar, we'd like to thank our sponsor, GCM board member Kostas Stefanidis, and we encourage you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice during the course of the year. Let's return to tonight's seminar, The Curse of Sisyphus, Clientelism and the Greek State by Dr. Aris Trantidis. Clientelism refers to the allocation of selective benefits by political actors or patrons to political supporters or clients. It thrives in both autocracies and democracies and exists in a large variety of cultural contexts. There's probably no country that's immune to it. It's just a degree that varies. In the case of Greece, it is quite ingrained and has caused considerable damage to both the economy and society. It has stunted the growth of Greek civil society. It results in lower coverage of social welfare programs. It exacerbates the brain drain. Corruption flourishes. It diminishes meritocracy and causes all sorts of social economic distortions and dislocations. And once these practices become embedded, they're difficult to reverse. Corrective measures and reforms are almost impossible to implement fully due to resistance from affected vested interest groups. The policy prescriptions are always severe. Greece has struggled to extract itself from this Sisyphus trap, often spending liberally when funds are accessible and then slamming the brakes when the money tap slows. The speaker today will not only look at the case of Greece, but also highlight that relatively functioning democracies, well-functioning democracies, are also vulnerable to straying off path. Some information about our speaker tonight. Dr. Aris Trantidis is a senior lecturer in international relations and politics at the University of Lincoln in the Midlands, UK. He has a multidisciplinary background with studies in politics, law, and political economy, and holds degrees from King's College London, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the Universities of Surrey, Thessaloniki, and Athens. He has a wide range of research interests, which include climate politics institutions to studying democratic resilience under the stresses of populism and authoritarianism. Inspiration for today's seminar is based on a book he published in 2016 by Routledge on clientelism and economic policy, Greece and the crisis. Dr. Trantidis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It's a great opportunity to speak to the Greek community in Australia and in Melbourne online. Good morning from the UK, by the way. Your introduction was quite concise, actually, and precise. So it allows me to skip several slides about what is clientelism, why should we care about clientelism. Let's move on then to defining this phenomenon a little bit more, because the prevalent view of clientelism is that this is a relationship between individual politicians and individual voters, and that it only mostly happens in developing countries, or in some cases in developed countries, but at the very bottom of the level of development among OECD countries such as Greece, or previously Italy and Portugal. Now, the clientelism in my research is not the exception to the rule, it is the rule of politics. Politics is a competitive process. It is about who wins, who gets access to the resources and the privileges that the state distributes. The state is the most powerful economic actor, by the way. It redistributes and it regulates. And in doing so, it creates winners and losers. So we have, on the one hand, the ideal vision of democracy, which is all about we vote our representatives based on who is more capable of providing goods and services when in power, according to our own ideological and political preferences. And these can vary from security, law, order to some basic services, healthcare, and education. But the reality is different. It is that most people actively engage with politics because they want to gain some personal gains out of that. It doesn't have to be necessarily money, although it is money in most cases, but it is some personal reputation, connections. It is the idea is that politicians themselves and other political actors who are not up for election, but they do engage in the process of politics, are just humans like everybody else. And while in the market, for instance, it's very plausible to be self-interested, utility maximizing individual trying to buy something at the lowest possible price or to sell as much as possible, in the marketplace, we accept this kind of not selfish, but at least utility maximizing, self-centered view of ourselves. In the politics, we have this ideal notion that it is all about the public interest, the common good, which is not. And it is not because politics is a competitive process. It creates winners and losers. Therefore, it is open to exchange. Just like the market is a process of exchange, politics is a process of exchange. But this process of exchange, of benefits, of special favors, I will help you, you help me, I will do you a favor in return for your loyalty, in return of your money, campaign money, for instance, is done within a structure of power. Okay, it's not voluntary transactions where I use my money to buy a product that you are selling. In that case, politicians use state resources and legislation that is supposed to regulate the general realm in a way that objectively leads to better results. They use those resources and they use legislation in order to gain profit. So there's a distance between what is expected and what is happening. And this is why clientelism is very problematic. Now, there is such thing as the clientelist exchange. And of course, you described it very well. Some of the benefits, of course, are jobs, promotions in the public sector, but also public procurement and government contracts. In some cases, up to a certain level up to a certain sum of money, some jurisdictions, some legislations do not oblige the state to conduct an open bidding process. So politicians can choose the government contractors, or they can provide information beforehand about what is required in this bidding process, so that certain companies could prepare, certain business actors could prepare a better bid. There are many state subsidies and also protectionist laws that protect certain industries from competition. And that can be the object of clientelist exchange. I will raise a tariff, I will reduce imports, or I will give you an export subsidy. But in return, you need to align yourself with me. I expect something from you. And it is an exchange between politicians, but also political organizations, political parties with the leadership, and sometimes quite prominent business actors or media owners who have and operate media, not just because they want to operate a business, but because they use the media as a tool to exert pressure on politics because they have other businesses that can profit from legislation and distribution. So it is a very key phenomenon in power, but it is very useful for politicians. Why do they do it? Because they need resources, campaign resources. And that's why clientelism doesn't really address the ordinary voter. It is a selective process because those resources to be distributed are not endless, okay? They are scarce resources. So politicians are very selective. And in this graph, they explains, it is in my book, Clientelism and Economic Policy, why this selection happens, how clientelism helps them, determines who are they going to help. They're going to help those who are going to give them the most valuable resources, campaign resources. So the clientelism is not, it doesn't have a direct effect on the electoral outcome, as the general literature used to assume, that it's vote buying, essentially. It's not a synonym of vote buying, because particularly in advanced economies, if I give you $50 or $100, it won't change your circumstances, won't persuade you to vote for me. And you can take that money and actually not vote for me, because there's no way I can monitor your behavior, your reciprocity. So clientelism doesn't have a direct effect with electoral success, with the exception of some societies in Africa, in local elections, where the patron goes around and gives some perks to voters. Usually, clientelism has an indirect effect in elections because it is used to attract and recruit active supporters, not just those who promise a vote, but those who are going to give their time and energy becoming active supporters, joining a party, establishing a permanent relationship of loyalty with the patron, with the political party or the politician, and of course the big donors, okay, those who are going to give sizable campaign resources. Now, politicians need those resources and active support to be able to appeal to the electorate, because no matter how great your ideas are, no matter how competent you are, and how attractive your message is, if you're not visible, nobody is going to take notice of your existence. Nobody's going to consider you as a candidate. So political competition needs money, requires resources, energy, active supporters, partisan supporters, and money, campaign money. And people may give some donations because of their ideology. It happened with Bernie Sanders, for instance, $20, $30. But the big money is given by big players, and these big players don't give money just because they believe that this message, this ideology, this program is great for the greatest public good. They are demanding something in return. They don't want to be ignored when legislation is going to pass. They want to have access to power. They're buying access to power. In some contexts, they're actually buying specific privileges. So they're very privileged in the sense that they can buy policy through clientelism. This is what they get. And the politicians or the political parties take campaign resources that allow them then to come to you, broadcast their message on TV, buy airtime, organize a campaign, and say, "Oh, my message is great. Vote for me." And that pertains to both political parties and individual candidates. So clientelism is essential, the glue that binds electoral competition and partisanship. So there are three forms of clientelism. People think about isolated voters, but usually clientelism creates networks, stable networks under the patron's control and party hierarchy, stable networks of loyalty where behavior is monitored. Okay, you need to show that in return for the benefit, the favor that you have received, you are indeed active and vocal. You're clapping hands, you're going to party meetings, you're supporting the politician, you're helping the campaign, or you actually gave the money, okay, or favorable airtime, for instance, if you own and operate a media. And sometimes this phenomenon is so widespread that it creates what I call fusion. So it permeates organizations such as trade unions, business associations, even the judiciary, okay? And therefore creates a hybrid clientelist system that this is actually a real danger to the health of the democracy. So clientelism can erode the autonomy of those formal structures or informal structures, civil society and media, or the judiciary, trade unions, that are supposed to act as a check on power. Democracy relies on checks and balances. Democracy is about not having a single party or a single leader dominating the agenda. It's all about countervailing forces. The judiciary is supposed to check the executive and the legislative. But with clientelism, even some parts of the judiciary can be compromised and co-opted. And it happens in many countries because judges are human beings. Okay, the judiciary system is not run by AI or robots. It is run by people who are also utility maximizers, okay, real people who may have family interests, a son or a daughter who may wants to work for the public sector or who runs a business. And clientelism is the way through which they can trade their position for favors to be done, not to them because they're judges, but to members of their family. Similarly, of course, with trade unions, because many trade unionists want a career in central politics. So if this system permeates civil society, the system becomes highly clientelistic, okay? And of course, the system means that politicians have a very powerful mode of interest accommodation because you get tangible benefits for yourself. It's more powerful than general public good provisions. Think about this example, for instance. If I'm a politician and I built a wonderful hospital nearby in your community, some of you may say, yes, well done, you built this wonderful hospital. Some of you will say, yes, but that's what you're supposed to be doing. We're paying taxes and we expect public services, and the hospital is a public service. I'm not going to change your views necessarily, particularly if you have a different ideology. But if I do a favor to you that creates a very sizable and considerable change in your personal or family circumstances, then you will owe me a favor. And some of you will still say no, but I guess that depending on how much the price is, some of you will see me more sympathetically. So it's a more powerful mode of interest accommodation than general provisions, like improving public infrastructure or providing better services, making politics very particularistic and discriminatory. And it has a strong incentivizing power and mobilizing power because the benefit is selective and concentrated. And it's a very effective strategy for gathering energized and active supporters and a lot of money, okay? But the problem is that all these public goods become private goods. Behind closed doors, everything become a private good to be exchanged through clientelist exchange. In the example of the hospital, for instance, depending on the institutions, I can hire people based on party loyalty if I can, or I can give contracts to my cronies to build that hospital or to operate that hospital as subcontractors. Okay, so even behind the creation of a public good or the lurks clientelist exchange, which is what makes politics a two-tier game: one that is visible to you and one that is not visible to you, that takes place behind closed doors. And that creates a problem with public policy because there is what I call a clientelist bias. Politicians prefer to accommodate the interest of their clients over the interest of the electorate. There is a misconception that politicians want to get elected, so the first group to appeal to is the electorate. In reality, clients come first because they are vital party resources, and any party in government or aspiring to becoming government prefers and must accommodate primarily the interest of their political clients because these are the core supporters, part of the infrastructure, of the mechanism through which they can later on, at a later stage, appeal to the electorate and become visible and send wonderful messages to you about how great they are. The political party cannot disregard those clientelist groups because otherwise it risks its own cohesion. They're going to lose resources. They may defect to another party, and it will undermine the strong mobilization mechanism that it had built on clientelism. I think this phenomenon better explains the Greek crisis, the Greek Odyssey, than the cultural explanation that somehow the Greeks are a bit lagging behind in terms of political culture, and that we have inherited very bad institutions from the Ottoman clientelist state. And because our history is not at the center of Europe, we always struggle to modernize our system, our politics, the economy, but there are always recalcitrant forces that takes us behind. This dichotomy between the modernizers and the recalcitrant forces is a very strong theme in Greek politics, but it is not explaining the Greek crisis, it's not even explaining clientelism, because clientelism happens everywhere. And in the 19th century, particularly, when this explanation is referring to, it was rampant even in places like America's Chicago policy, Chicago politics. They have this phrase, machine politics, back then to describe clientelism. In my explanation, this is a rational thing. It is reproduced not because of cultural characteristics, but because it is rational for everybody to take part in this clientelist game, including, of course, the major political actors, insofar as this is happening. That's why Greeks, when they leave Greece and live in places like Australia, their behavior changes because there is a different environment with different incentives. They have to adapt to a different environment, so they change their behavior to be able to survive and thrive in a different environment. And they have done a great job. Okay, the Greek community of Melbourne is living proof that the Greeks behave differently and thrive and make us proud in different places across the world. And it's only Greece that is about this pathology, trapped in this suboptimal situation. So my book, if you want, it's online and you can download it as a ebook. It's an academic book, so it's not the easiest read. Unfortunately, it's not in any of the libraries in Australia. It is, the closest one is in Taiwan, but but you can find it online. It explains especially the period known as the Metapolitevsy as a clientelist game. And this clientelist game, if we can put it here, is a game theory with a decision tree. Decision tree is a way to portray game theory in economics and political science over a period of time. So the first player is New Democracy. So New Democracy inherits a clientelist network from right-wing governments that ruled most of the time in Greece in the 50s and the 60s, with few intervals. And it has an advantage because this clientelism allows New Democracy to be strong, mobilizing, coherent, and internally unified. And but back then, of course, there was a division between the left and the right that was quite strong because of memories from the Civil War and what happened afterwards, the dictatorship, the period that is better described as semi-authoritarianism before, this problematic democracy, exclusionary democracy of the 50s and the 60s. So PASOK comes as a new wave, a new political force that is able to attract that vote from the center left because the Communist Party is not as attractive, its ideology is hardlining, and the traditional centrist parties are quite old and tired. So because New Democracy has already engages in clientelism, which is the first choice that it did, PASOK, the party that the outsider has two options, if you see. One is to engage, and the other one is to abstain. In 1981, Andreas Papandreou is elected as a prime minister, but even before that, the great dilemma is, will I be a little bit like New Democracy and create my own clientelist network? And the choice is yes, I will, because otherwise PASOK wouldn't be able to counter the strong mobilization mechanism that New Democracy had. So it built a much better, actually, more functional clientelist system with claviques, with a very centralized system of clientelism controlled by the center at the local level, with branches that, like a pyramid, refer back to the leader, because the leader has to assume control over this movement that is becoming a party in government, and wants to have a very energized party base who is likely to be disappointed when PASOK doesn't do exactly what it has promised to do, because actually governing a country is much more difficult than giving several promises before. And PASOK retains this strong mobilization capacity, partly thanks to clientelism, up until the economic crisis, the Greek crisis in 2012, when this system is shaped and the distributional channels temporarily are withheld because Greece was on the brink of financial collapse. So in this particular graph, that graph shows you why clientelism is the dominant strategy for two parties. Because if one party decides not to do it, it is in a position of disadvantage. Okay, it's a rational political strategy, and of course, the outcome of that, because both parties were overbidding in clientelism, is several distortions and fiscal profligacy, because hiring people in the public sector is costly, and they're not there because of meritocracy, so they're not doing a very good job. It's also sustained rampant corruption in the public sector, because people appointed this way, their behavior was to some extent tolerated. And in an article that I wrote with Vasiliki Tsagroni a few years ago, small petty corruption was a way to outsource clientelism by allowing your clients to engage in small petty corruption, asking for bribes when you want, for instance, to have a license, a driving license in Greece. I don't know if it's happening today, but it was happening 20 years ago, you have to give some money to not the instructor, the examiner. Okay, and they knew that it was happening, but they tolerated because that's a way to outsource the cost of corruption. When you pay the bribe, you pay it from your own pocket. Okay, so the government doesn't have to give extra money to their clients. It does allow them. It just allows them to be corrupt to some extent. The same with building regulations and everything essentially, business licenses. Corruption was rampant because it was tolerated. So the fiscal and economic cost of clientelism led to the crisis. Partly, of course, that's not the only explanation, but apparently, while every country experienced the global financial crisis in 2009, it was Greece that it was in the weakest position, and incidentally, Greece had the most overgrown and costly clientelist system. But it was, everybody knew that this might happen, that the clientelism is a bad thing, but no party had an incentive to curb clientelism, because if you unilaterally try to limit the supply of patronage, what you're doing essentially is you're undermining yourself. Because the other party will come and say, now that the government is not helping you, come and vote for me, and I will be your new patron. Or even within the same party in government, opportunist politicians who want to topple down the leadership, will start saying the current leader is not helping you, but if you help me become the leader of the party, okay, I will be the one giving you all these perks and benefits. So any decision to limit the supply of clientelism because you're seeing in front of you a catastrophe, a crisis coming, it was actually a big risk for the politicians, for the political leadership itself, not only because it will give an advantage to your opponents outside the party, but it will also give an advantage to your opponents within the party. Okay? Right. So I think that explains why reform was almost impossible in Greece, okay? And economic reform was inevitable. The kind of austerity politics and reform that Greece had to implement over time, it shows a very interesting pattern. So governments did not really shy away from unpopular reforms. There was austerity throughout this time. There was also wage freeze in 1985, by the way, by the Papandreou government, right after his second re-election. There was even an incomes policy implemented. But all of those measures were measures that targeted everybody. When taxes go up or when wages freeze, the cost is dispersed among the population, okay? But despite the unpopularity of those measures, they didn't touch their own clients because they were willing to displease the electorate to some extent, hoping that before the election they will be able to give something back, okay, the last minute. But even if they knew that the general population wouldn't be happy with austerity, with higher taxes, at least they need to keep their clients happy because they will need them in the next election when they will come back and say, look, things are going to be better. If you elect me, the economy now is stabilized. I can promise you a better days ahead. But they need those clients to give them their energy, their time, and campaign money to be able to say what they want to say and justify why they had to impose those unpopular measures on the general population in the first time. So every time the crisis receded, clientelism was again intensified. So before the election, after austerity in 1985 and 1987, Papandreou would start spending again and hiring people in the public sector, similarly with New Democracy in 1980, 1981, and later on. So there are some key lessons from Greece. The lessons from Greece that I would like to share with you in Australia. Why should you be interested in Greece if you have left? I mean, you love Greece, but most of you are not going to return there. The lessons from Greece are lessons that have value worldwide because it shows that clientelism, once it is established, it is very hard to be diminished, to be derooted, to go away, because there is a strong incentive for political organizations to expand and intensify clientelism at all levels, including elite level, okay, deals with special interests, with lobbies, with big corporations. And this can undermine the terms of political competition shifting politicians' focus further away from catering for the public good to privileging the interest of the clients. It will create a dysfunctional economy, and this economy won't be reformed, or it would be saved temporarily through measures that diffuse the cost on everybody else but the clients. It could derail public finances and lay the foundations for a crisis. So, in a way, once an economic system and a political system becomes heavily clientelist, it is very difficult to escape from this suboptimal situation. This is why several countries in the world are highly clientelist. Most of the world essentially is clientelistic, from Africa to Latin America and most parts of Asia, if not all parts of Asia, and quite a lot in Europe as well, Eastern Europe in particularly. It's very difficult to escape from this suboptimal situation, and we keep wondering why they're not developing. Why we give them money, there is access to markets, and they have some of those countries young population, but they're not really growing, because those countries, the leaderships in those countries, have very few incentives to abstain from clientelism and corruption, because in some countries the legal system is so weak, so much eroded by clientelism, that you can actually be openly, blatantly corrupt. Okay, think about countries in Africa, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa. So crisis becomes a periodic phenomenon, if not a permanent situation. And if we think that this phenomenon is only limited to those countries, think again, because in my analysis suggests that there is a tendency in political systems towards clientelism, towards favoritism. And the great question, and I'd like to discuss this question with you, is how you prevent this from happening in your societies, and how can you curb that tendency before it is too late. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions if there are any.
Okay, Aris, thank you for that thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure the questions will start to roll in, but I might kickstart the questioning. How does the rise of Syriza change or complicate the system you're describing now, the dynamics?
That's a good question, because Syriza was a small party and all of a sudden became a major one. And it stayed in power for 4 years in a coalition government with Anel, dealing with, of course, the difficult situation of the last decade with the memorandum. Now, from my observation, Syriza doesn't have this strong, widespread clientelist network. It didn't build it, maybe it didn't want to, or it couldn't, didn't have the opportunity. I'm not here to judge intention. But currently, after PASOK's collapse and the collapse of its own clientelist network, part of the clientelist the PASOK's clientelist network moved to New Democracy. New Democracy survived because at that point it was the biggest party in the beginning of the 2000s and absorbed a large part of that network, becoming the dominant clientelist network in Greece right now. It doesn't mean that it actually gives a lot of what it has promised, but sometimes you have to know that clientelism doesn't have to be costly, doesn't have to take the form of appointments in the public sector. It can be, first of all, elite level, so catering for special interest, or it can be anything from favorable terms of military service to insider information, or to small positions like internships in the public sector, and favors for small companies. It's also, and at the moment, the risk with one party clientelism, the risk is that you are heading to a situation that resembles Hungary, for instance, places where there is one dominant clientelist network with semi-authoritarian tendencies. Because while a two-party clientelist system is a bad thing because it generates this tendency of increasing clientelism again and again, at least you have some form of checks and balances. One party controls the other. They are both equally visible in the media because they have their own media outlets. And civil society, although permeated by clientelism, is somehow split between those two parties. When you have one party, one dominant party system, and one single clientelist network, then there is an imbalance here, and you have the party can control the agenda, can control information, can co-opt the media, or at least the mainstream media, and the other party is much weaker, confined to a secondary place in politics.
Do you think in your research, have you uncovered, would you say there's a direct relationship between the strength of a private sector in a country and also clientelistic practices? Because Greece relatively has got a weaker private sector, and also a private sector which is very much dependent on state favoritism and contracts and so forth. Is there a relationship there, or does it not necessarily?
Say it again, the last part.
Isn't a relationship between the strength of a private sector in a country and the level of clientelistic practices?
It's not the size of the private sector. Some people think, okay, if you privatize, then the state cannot appoint. It doesn't. The turf for clientelism is diminished. That's not true, because private businesses operate in a regulatory framework, and some of them essentially depend on state subsidies, protectionism, state regulation, business opportunities that the state creates when it subcontracts. When you build a highway, when you give contracts to businesses for all sorts of things that you had privatized before. Okay, like even if you privatize education, the state decides about licenses, about who gets the opportunity to make money. If you privatize the highways, the state is the one that gives the license, that gives the contract to certain companies to operate the highway. So even if the size of the state becomes smaller, clientelism doesn't necessarily become smaller. What keeps clientelism small is strong institutions, independent from the political parties, that can actually act as countervailing forces and checks and balances, able to spot irregularities and expose those irregularities. And then there is either a judicial process or there is public shame if they're exposed in the media. So it is the strength and the autonomy of the civil society. And that is essentially a circular argument, because if clientelism is already strong, the civil society is not independent and strong enough against that. But if the state is still somehow limited in terms of how much it can discriminate and pick up winners, not in terms of what it does, but in terms of the discriminatory capacity to choose winners based on partisan criteria, then the civil society should act as a guardian that this system survives and it doesn't slip into clientelism. So you have to be vigilant at this point, because after a certain threshold, it's too late for those societies to resist this backsliding into clientelism and one party or two party hegemony.
I think you might have partly answered the next question from Costas. I've read that countries such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea were highly corrupt and engaged in clientelistic politics, but managed to overcome them with long-term anti-corruption programs. Can such programs work in Greece?
Well, it's an interesting question. The truth is that Hong Kong used to be, and Singapore is, a small state. And the same goes with Israel as well, because they were clientelistic enough. But the thing is that those elites realize that they can only survive if they're a little bit efficient as well. So they need to have a working, functional state and a functional economy. Otherwise, they will be swallowed by larger nearby countries, or they will face a security problem. And of course, elites don't want that, because they are there because the country is secure enough to function as a state. So they face this dilemma that what kind of corruption as well they are willing to tolerate or they're willing to engage. Those countries like Taiwan and South Korea, they were very corrupt, but they were also developmental. They were doing favors to big families that run the industries, but those industries were getting export subsidies, and then they were allowed to trade with the world in preferential trade terms, and build an infant industry that became strong. And today we buy a lot of products from those countries, because there was a combination of yes, we're here to make money, we're here to be dominant and to get reelected, or in some cases there was no democracy in the past in South Korea. We're here to have power and to be secure in that power through networking with powerful families. But at the same time, our state has to develop, otherwise it will collapse, because we have North Korea, or we have China, or we're in the Middle East, for instance. So there is a combination here of corruption with development, that is not optimal because the country can develop, but it can develop under one-party hegemony, like Malaysia, for instance. One party can be very dominant. Even in Japan, for instance, the Liberal Party has been in power for most of the time. So there are still side effects to that. But yes, it is possible. It has happened. It depends on the circumstances. In the case of Greece, for instance, because Greece didn't have that problem, Greece was given very generously funds from the European Union. So this system was revamped by a flow of money that were supposed to be spent on infrastructure. They were spent on infrastructure, but with very costly projects and with a lot of squandering and waste. Particularly, remember the Olympic Games, for instance, where there were last-minute direct contracts and high skyrocketing costs. It was squandered. We have received more money than any other European member state, European Union member state per capita, and we don't have one single railway line that is functional connecting our two major cities. The level of corruption that has happened in Greece is incredible.
The next question is from our sponsor, Kostas Stefanidis. It's in Greek, but I'll translate it. When Greece had its economic issues and problems in 2011, with the economic crisis of 2011, you can sort of observe two changes. One was the reduced participation in the elections. I think around half the population didn't participate. And the other tendency was that in the, let's say, intra-party procedures and processes, people weren't taking part either. There's reduced participation within those intra-party sort of processes. What's your opinion on that?
Yes, well, it has to do also with the fact that many Greeks are registered as voters, but they live abroad. For instance, I haven't voted for so many years because I live in the UK. So many others had to leave the country. But it also has to do with apathy as well. People believe that nothing, really think that nothing would change with politics, or if the elections happen in the summer, many young people would work temporarily in tourist destinations, and they don't think they would. I don't think they would care paying the money to go back to their home and vote. People believe, and it's true, that a single vote doesn't change things. You are 1 out of 10 million in Greece, or 1 out of 7 million voters. So you have a modicum of influence. If you think about it, we have one choice every 4 years, 5 years in some constituencies. If it is in a first past the post system, usually between two parties, over a huge range of issues, a bundle of policies, and our influence is only 1 out of 7 million, 1 out of 10 million, or 15 million in Australia. So it's not really rational to spend money and energy unless you are energized because you expect something more from politics, and that's how even if there are high levels of low levels of voter turnout, the clients are going to go and vote, and that's a danger, because a government will say, despite the low turnout, I have been elected. I got 40%, 35%. So they will still claim legitimacy, even if others have just given up, they're apathetic, and they have lost faith in this process.
Next question is from Steve Bakalis. Australia steered away from clientelism and towards a consensus approach. Do you think Greece will ever cut the Gordian knot of clientelism? How can the diaspora help?
Well, I'm not familiar with the Australian case, but I can assure you that there is a lot of clientelism at the high level, at the elite level. In some systems do not, politicians in those systems and political parties do not have to appeal to the general voter or to party members with clientelism, because the way the campaign takes place is all about getting campaign resources and use those resources to organize a campaign and buy airtime and become visible. So they only have to appeal to specific special interest to help them. So I can talk about the US case because I'm familiar with the US case. There, it's the huge scale of the electoral competition in federal elections, but also in some state elections. One state can be the size of Greece, for instance. It means that you can't go and reach every single voter or a small group. with clientelist perks. What you need is to approach big donors, okay? And what is happening in America with big donors, giving money in return for policy concessions, for access, privileged access to power, is clientelism. So clientelism hasn't gone away. Clientelism has a different form there. It's elite level, but it's not diffused. It's not inclusive. Okay, we're excluded from that because we don't matter anymore as individual voters or small groups for the big political organizations and the big political candidates.
I've got another question in Greek from Kypros Kyprianou. Now translate it. It's also in our chat, Adi. If you're saying that across all the planet, there are clientelistic states, there was some level of clientelism, are we exaggerating by saying sort of democracies is almost dead, a dead system?
Well, I'm a theorist of democracy, and my work after clientelism is all about the quality of democracy. Well, democracy, the ideal form, demos in control of kratos, never existed, okay? It is not ancient Greece where there was direct democracy, at least among the citizens, those who had the right to be citizens. It is a representative system. It's an elite system, essentially, but a competitive and open to participation and contestation. So insofar as we are allowed to protest, to contest politics, insofar as the system is relatively open to different views, to pluralism, then it is worth having democracy because it is a system that essentially tries to tame the beast. Okay, we're trying to tame the beast. What is the beast? Political power. Political power has always been, historically speaking, capricious, tyrannical, murderous, genocidal. Okay, but we have achieved to tame that with a system of general rules, constitutional rules, with political participation and citizenship that gives us at least some form of some dignity and some input into that system. So democracy is not dead as a real system where elites know their boundaries. They know that they can get something out of politics, but they have to say something good or do something good for us eventually because we're voters. They know the limits. There is an independent, slightly or relatively independent judiciary. They can be exposed if they go over that limit by the media. So it's a system of checks and balances, relying on countervailing forces that tames the beast. And human societies have achieved something after centuries of dealing with barons and kings and emperors. It's a great, great achievement. But we have to be vigilant because with clientelism, we risk, some countries particularly risk ending with a situation that we name in political science electoral authoritarianism. This is what is happening in Russia, for instance, or in Belarus, where you do vote, but the information you receive is already filtered through the state and their cronies, because there's no other network, clientelist network there. Everybody has to be loyal to the leader. Otherwise, they risk being ostracized and they risk retribution and retaliation. So the whole system doesn't really give genuine opportunities for contestation. We remain silent, we accept what it is, and we end up with a process of election in which we simply accept that the same leader would be elected again and again and again. The leader would claim that his rule is legitimate, but the whole process has been skewed. The playing field is not level and fair. The level playing field is not fair, and as the result, we have a semblance of democracy that acts as the new legitimation mechanism for the leader. In the past, it was my rule comes from God. Okay, that's what the king said. It's God-given. Now it's, oh, the people elect me. That's what Putin says. But all the terms of the political competition have been skewed in advance to allow only Putin to be visible and to be able to campaign and to isolate or even exterminate after a certain point anyone who could could pose a risk to his hegemony.
Another question from Steve Bakalis. Do you think the implementation of some reforms associated with the Trantidis Commission recommendations since 2019 provide for strong narrative for the government, or have they served clientelism? Again, I think most of our viewers probably aren't familiar with the Trantidis Commission anyway. If you can say a few things about that. Adi?
Well, it's a classical. The opponents would say it's a neoliberal agenda. It's about reforms, about privatization and institutional reforms, but it hasn't been implemented. Most of it was discussed and forgotten As I said, even in a neoliberal context, in the context in which the state doesn't own a lot, the state still regulates. So the state can still be clientelistic. It's the Pisaridis proposal is about formal institutions and policies, but clientelism is an informal system that exists as a parasite. It comes and hijacks the formal institutions. So even if typically you have an independent judiciary and you have independent agencies and authorities regulating the industry, you have an independent authority for telecommunications, an independent authority to regulate the energy market that is privatized. These people, there's no guarantee that these people would be independent from political pressures or pressures from business, from the business, from those businesses who are active in that industry. So we have to pay attention to informal connections, informal relationship of exchange that happen, and they can happen even in a Pisaridis universe where the state is more limited and there are independent agencies and there are institutions that are supposed to act in a certain way that doesn't really correspond to the reality of politics, which is, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, the logic of exchange, the logic of personal gain.
Okay, thank you for that. Ari, we know that you're sort of to the time point, you've got a lecture to go to. Thank you very much for your time. Best of luck with future research, and hopefully one day we'll see you in Australia in the flesh as well. And you're more than welcome anytime at the Greek community of Melbourne.
Well, I hope so. I hope that you found my presentation and our discussion interesting. And it's more early morning. It was early morning here in the UK, but I'm very happy to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to our next opportunity to have a discussion with your community. Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay. Thanks once again.
Bye-bye. Good evening.